And I'd like to thank you for taking your time to be with us today, talking to the students at UNL about who you are and what you do,
Sure.
and some of the important work that you're doing in regards to sustainability in agriculture. So I'd like to first, if you wouldn't mind, introduce yourself.
Yes, happy to join you. Glad to be here. My name is Keith Berns. My brother Brian and I started Green Cover Seed in 2009, but we've been farming here all of our lives. This is the farm we grew up on. So we've been farming here. I taught school for 10 years and then came back to the farm. He started farming right out of college. So this is our home. This is where we grew up, and we've been doing the cover crop side of things with Green Cover since 2009. So Green Cover is a cover crop seed provider, but we like to think that we provide not only the seed, but also a lot of knowledge, a lot of resources, a lot of recommendations, and we do that through a number of different, webinars, videos, soil health resource guides, things like that. We started in like I said, we grew up farming here. We've been no-tilling since my brother started experimenting with that in the 80s, and by the 90s we were converted over to 100% no-till. And then started experimenting with cover crops in 2008 and really saw the benefits to the soil, the benefits to the livestock, and we especially saw the benefits of a diverse mix. We saw how when we mixed these different species together, it was more moisture efficient, it grew more biomass, everything was healthier, the livestock did fantastic on it. And so we set Green Cover up in 2009 specifically to make diverse cover crop mixes for the market and make customized ones. So we knew that one size wasn't going to fit everybody when it comes to these mixes. So at this point we have like 120 different things you can choose from, and we will put those into different mix combinations according to what we think is going to be best for the needs of your operation. We're currently, shipping all to all 50 states, most all of Canada, doing some international stuff, but primarily here, in the High Plains area, but shipping 35 to 40 million pounds of seed to 20,000 plus people in all 50 states. Is kind of what keeps us busy on a daily basis.
Connected to that, and I think you started to touch on this just a little bit. What are the primary benefits of cover crops in an agricultural operation?
Well, there's a lot of benefits. The ones that people probably focus on the most because they're kind of the low-hanging fruit, if you will. Number one, it just almost eliminates erosion. If you have a cover crop growing out there between your main crops, you're protecting that ground both from water erosion and wind erosion, and so that's one of the most immediate things that we see is you can just really mitigate any kind of erosion risk. We see the weed suppressing ability of them as well, particularly, like in the case of cereal rye against mare's tail, we can almost eliminate that as a problem weed and I'm speaking from our own operation. The weed suppressive ability of cover crops, again, when the timing is right, when it's the right species, can be really good. We've got a lot of people starting to look at it for nitrogen production. As the price of synthetic nitrogen goes up, the value that we can bring from a legume crop or a legume-based mix continues to go up as well. And we've got, we ran some experiments the last couple of years where, we can grow 200 plus pounds of nitrogen with a hairy vetch crop or a winter pea crop if you're willing to give it enough time to grow in the spring. We can grow 150 pounds of nitrogen generally in 60 to 75 days in the summertime coming in following wheat. So the nitrogen fixation is becoming a bigger one. It's always been a big deal for the organic producers, but again, as that price of nitrogen has gone up, more and more people are starting to look at that as an option. One of the things that we have really seen in the last 5-6 years and just begin to understand it a lot more is the benefit to the soil biology that these cover crops are bringing. And that, there's, as tests get better, as there's more awareness about what that biology looks like, we just see all the benefits that brings to the table and how cover crops are benefiting that. The pollinator support, a lot of these things, we can put things out there that are going to bloom and will really help support the pollinator communities. the wildlife benefits, and frankly, one of the biggest things that people will use these for, because it's the most directly connected to a cash income, is the supplemental grazing benefits of these, and how we can plant these and get 6 to 8 weeks of growth and then turn livestock out there. And with properly managed grazing, it can actually improve or accelerate the soil health benefits of it. With improperly managed grazing, it can actually set you back. And so, like anything, it really boils down to the operator and their ability to manage it properly within the context of what they have to work with.
So within the context of studying agriculture and studying horticulture, one of the terms that we frequently use is sustainability. And we look at that from several different perspectives. We think about that in terms of economics and the environmental benefits and the social benefits. And I appreciate your comment on how cover crops integrate into that concept of sustainability.
Well, in my mind, sustainability means, are we still going to have these resources for my children, my grandchildren, their children to use, down the road? Both the resources and, soil and water being the main ones, but also people resources, our communities. We've seen a lot of rural communities really erode away, like the topsoil the land has. And so we think cover crops can address all of those, certainly with the soil conservation. I mentioned how, one of the biggest benefits is just reducing or eliminating the erosive qualities of rainfall and of wind by simply keeping it covered, having a living root in the soil. So those things certainly are going to lead to the long-term sustainability of a farming system if we keep the topsoil there. But beyond that, it goes beyond the sustainability and moves into the regenerative part of it, the regenerative agriculture, in that we're seeing many producers actually start to regrow and replenish both the amount of topsoil they have and the amount of carbon they have in what's already there. And those, again, that moves beyond sustainable and gets into, now it's not just keeping the status quo, but it's making what we have better. And anytime you can do that, then that's going to make you, long-term sustainable. So, that's for the soil, and for the farmer, particularly the small to medium-sized farmer and the communities, it allows people, by farming with less inputs and higher management, you can be more profitable and you can make a go of it on smaller acres, which is how many of these small communities came to be. There was a farm on every quarter, a farm on every section, and that's, we had families and kids, and I'm not saying we're going to go back to that, but we can go back that direction a little bit and move back towards having a more sustainable rural economy. And you can't do that if you got one guy farming 20,000 acres. So we see that the cover crops, the soil health movement can play into, community and farmer sustainability.
This is something you touched on a little bit, and particularly we're interested in organic agriculture. So how do cover crops contribute to soil health and soil fertility in an organic growing system?
Well, I think in multiple ways. The most obvious, the most talked about and well known, I guess, would be just simply nitrogen fixation through legume cover crops. And again, we've got good documentation of 200 plus pounds in a hairy veg crop and winter peas, and that's you can take a clipping and measure that. So that part of it is fairly well known, understand, has been practiced and used for many years. But we're starting to see more and more of just both a nutrient cycling, which just simply means, taking the nutrients out of the previous year's biomass and cycling it back for the crop. But I would say also a nutrient, I don't know if you call it liberation, or, making nutrients available that are in your soil, because our soils are made up of minerals. Minerals are these nutrients that plants need. So the more biological activity you have, because plants themselves aren't going to liberate or make those available, it's the biology that's doing that, but the biology can't live without the plant. And so it takes both of them to do it. You grow the plants, the biology comes, the biology can make the phosphorus available, the potassium available, all these other trace minerals, these trace elements. Many of them are in our soils. They're just tied up in a form that plants can't get to. So when we have the biology there that's being supported by the plant community, and again, the more diverse of a plant community, the more diverse of a biological community, the more diverse of a nutrient profile that you're going to be freeing up and making available for that organic farming operation. And so, in those cases, we know that there's people now that have reduced or eliminated almost all forms of outside nutrient amendment. Maybe they'll put some compost on, but they've just got the system so biologically active that it's cycling and providing those nutrients. And that's largely only going to happen if you have a growing root out there as often as possible. And cover crops often are the way to do that in addition to the cash cropping system.
So in adopting a new agricultural practice for a particular farm, and speaking with many farmers over the years, one of the barriers they experience in that is just not knowing where to start, not knowing what the first step is.
Yeah.
So for cover crops, and again, particularly for organic farming, if you have someone who's transitioning, if you have someone who wants to initiate a cover crop program for their organic farm, where would you tell them to begin?
We often joke about YouTube University. Yeah. But it's true, there is a lot of good information out there. Now, there's a lot of bad information too, so you have to still exhibit some level of discernment in doing that, but there's a tremendous amount of resources out there. We put all of our content, on YouTube, and there's other platforms as well. So I would say find some sources that you trust and then go see what content they have made. And it may be a company like us, like Green Cover, or it might be a speaker like a Christine Jones or a Gabe Brown or a Ray Archuleta, and then just go start searching and finding that information out there. And typically, one thing leads to another, and pretty soon you've wasted, but you've spent an entire evening, watching YouTube videos around the topic and the subject. So I would not be afraid to just jump in and start looking at the content that people have made and put out on YouTube, the either a recorded conference or a seminar or a webinar that's been done. That's a great starting point because that's not going to cost you any money. All it's going to do is cost you some time, and then from that you can decide, okay, I'd like to take a deeper dive into this topic or that topic, and then you can go to places like John Kemp's AEA site has some paid courses, that will be very sequential, very structured, very thorough, that you can sign up for, pay a few $100 or whatever it is, and take that extended course. I know that Nicole Masters has similar things, Elaine Ingham, there's really good teaching out there. I'd start with the free stuff to kind of see what you like, see who you like, and then you can kind of find some of these paid services if you really want to take that deeper dive into it.
A little bit more deeply into the benefits of cover crops. There's several different ones I appreciate your comment on. Starting with erosion control, which is an incredibly important issue for agriculture broadly. So what is the role of cover crops in prevention of erosion?
Well, I think there's multiple ways that cover crops prevent erosion. The first one just being, from the fact of having a canopy out there, you're absorbing the impact of a rainfall, the raindrop. It hits the leaf and then it slowly falls off to the surface, and so it's preventing that breaking up of the soil crust, which leads to, or the breaking up of the soil surface, which leads to crusting, which will almost eliminate infiltration, and then you just have all kinds of erosion issues. And so that can also happen from a non-living cover if you have enough wheat stubble or corn stalks or other things out there. The living cover, though, is so much more resilient because it's not going to blow away, it's not going to decompose and degrade, and so the combination of both is really ideal. You've got your duff surface down here from dead and decomposing residue, but then you've got a living canopy as well that is resilient and continues to grow and prevent that. So number one, it's just absorbing that impact of a raindrop or of the wind. You know, if you've got something growing, all that impact of the wind is being absorbed by, you know, this stuff above the ground, and then the soil surface, which is susceptible to, you know, you start moving those particles and, you know, creating little mini avalanches in your field. It's just preventing that by absorbing that energy of the wind flow as well. And then further, with a living cover crop, you've got that root system that's actually anchoring things in place. And so, especially in areas where, you know, accumulation of runoff, you know, rill areas, gullies, ephemeral areas, you know, those roots are actually going to physically hold that soil in place as well, and actually can catch silt and sedimentation that's coming from upstream, and actually catch that, slow that down, you know, make those sediment particles fall out, and actually kind of build your soil by capturing some of that sediment load as well. So those two things, and then the third thing would be, you know, having those living root structures. The amount of infiltration is just, you know, much greater where you've got a cover crop, or had a cover crop, you know, maybe you terminate it, but you still have some of those benefits, both from the root channels as well as from the biology, particularly earthworms. We just see earthworm populations explode in these cover crop fields. In water that's infiltrating into your soil and not running off is not going to erode. And so by increasing that infiltration, it reduces the erosive effects of a big, heavy, intense rain, which seems like that's how most of them are coming anymore. So the more infiltration, the better.
Connected to that, water is going to be one of the most pressing concerns in agriculture for the future, in my mind.
Yep.
And I believe cover crops play an important role in water management. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, they do. Cover crops do play an important role in water management, and this is hard for people to understand. You can either use cover crops to preserve and conserve water, or you can use them to get rid of excess water. Now, most of us in Nebraska don't have that latter problem, but as you move further east into the Corn Belt, you know, those guys are using spring plant or spring growing cover crops quite often just to be able to get into their fields and get things planted. You know, so having a, you know, planting green into cereal rye or ryegrass or hairy vetch or something like that, it gives them the ability to plant in a wet spring, and then they terminate after planting, and, you know, then it's a really nice system. From a moisture conservation standpoint, again, cover crops are going to take moisture to grow. I mean, that's just a physical fact. They're going to need water to grow. Now, we've seen that the diverse mixes use less water to grow the same amount of biomass as anything in a monoculture does, but they still take moisture. And so from a moisture conservation standpoint, the moisture that a cover crop uses, we have to be able to replace that and then go above and beyond that amount through recapturing. And so the ways that we do that, number one, is through better infiltration. If it's a summer or fall planted cover crop, we can accumulate more snow catch. You know, in years where we have snow, if we can grow some taller structure, we can knock down and hold a lot of snow. So you got better infiltration, better snow catch, and then far less evaporation. By keeping that ground covered, you know, we lose far less to the evaporative effects of having bare exposed soil. And so the combination of those, given enough time, will not only replace the water, the moisture that the cover crops use, but will go above and beyond that. Now, the further west you go, the more arid you are, the longer period of time it takes to replenish that. So, you know, if you're in North Platte, Nebraska, you can't, in a dryland situation, you can't have cereal rye growing, terminate at May 10th, plant your corn May 12th, and expect that system's going to work. It's not. Now, this year, a lot of rain out there maybe would have, but most years, that's going to be a complete disaster. And then people will point to the cover crop and say, well, see, that could never work. But if they had wheat the year before and they planted a cover crop, the frost took it out October 1st, but they had 3-foot tall sorghum out there and sunflowers, it knocked down a whole bunch of snow that then infiltrated right down those root channels into that. That stopped using moisture as soon as it froze in October. They're not planting their corn until May. Well, now I've had, you know, that's 7, 8, 9, 10 months of capture and recapturing moisture. In that situation, they're probably going to be moisture ahead versus moisture behind. And so it all depends on that context of where you're at. But you just have to look at that recharge window of how long that's going to take, and then that really determines what you can plant, how long you can let it grow, and when you have to terminate it. Here in south central Nebraska, we treat our irrigated much different than we treat our dry land when it comes to that, because we know we can recharge our moisture profile with irrigation if we have to, but with the dry land, we don't have that opportunity, so we have to make management decisions based on that.
One of the challenges it's a challenge for everyone in agriculture, but I think sometimes it's more challenging in an organic production system. It's dealing with pest insects and the various diseases that crops can suffer from. How do cover crops play a role in management of those various stresses?
Well, a complicated topic, and I would boil it down mostly to diversity. Most diseases, most insects, most of these things come largely as a result of lack of diversity within our cropping system. So if you're just growing continuous corn or continuous wheat, you're just going to get hammered by all manner of things, because nature figures that out, the weeds figure it out, the insects, the diseases, they all figure that pattern out, and they're going to come in and take advantage of that. But the more diverse you get, then the harder it is for any of these pests to catch up to you and figure that out. So cover crops are not the answer, but they're part of the solution. The solution is to become much more diverse in your rotation. And what cover crops can do is, again, if I'm harvesting wheat, I can plant a cover crop mix now that has 10, 12, 15 different species in it. Now I've got all these different species growing. I can grow them for 60, 80, 90 days through the summer. I just introduced a huge amount of diversity into my system now, confused the heck out of the insects, the diseases, and the weeds, because it's completely different than what the pattern had been. But yet I don't have to harvest those crops. I don't have to have specialized knowledge to market them and do things like that. So the cover crops can introduce huge levels of diversity in a really short window of time. Now, you still need to be more diverse than just growing corn and beans. You still need to have wheat, you need to have livestock. So the more diverse you are, the less issues you're going to have with all these things, and cover crops will help bring a lot of that diversity in there. Further, we have cover crop mixes specific that have a lot of flowering plants that will attract a lot of beneficial and predatory type insects. So using some of these insectary strips, in key areas can have populations of, ladybugs and lacewings and some of the predatory wasps. It can give them an environment to live in, so that when you do have a pest outbreak somewhere, you've got a population there that can now grow and increase and go take care of things out in your crop field. But that may not have happened if you didn't have some sort of a refuge or a habitat strip there for them. And we can do that. You can do that with perennials, but it gets quite expensive. And then you're stuck with that strip in the same place every year. So we can emulate that with annuals, do it much cheaper, and then you can move that strip around wherever you think you might need it. So that's another way that we've seen people utilize cover crops to address the pest issue.
With cover crops, with the variety of roles that they can potentially play in a production system, and the number of crops that are used as cover crops, for a producer who is beginning a cover crop program, how would you recommend that they approach prioritizing the roles of cover crops, and how would you recommend a particular cover crop for them?
The first thing I would do is I would look at where is my biggest fallow gaps. Because again, there's no magic in cover crops. The magic is in having a growing plant. So if you got that covered, with a cash crop, well, great, but where's your biggest gaps? And so, in a corn bean rotation, of course, it's after harvest and before planting. That's a fairly short window. There's things you can do, but it's going to be relatively, you can't get a huge amount of diversity. You don't have a really long growing window. But again, if you have wheat in that rotation, there's a 10 to 11 month gap between harvesting wheat and planting the next crop the following spring. So that's a huge gap. Well, let's fill that gap first. That's the easiest place to do it. It's the safest place to do it. We have the most time. We have the most diversity options. So look for what those biggest fallow gaps are and kind of plug those holes first. And then secondly, look at where the easiest termination times are going to be. So it's easier to terminate a cover crop ahead of soybeans, which are not dependent upon having residual nitrogen in the soil to kind of get going. That's a much easier way to fit cover crops in than ahead of corn, because corn, if I have a cereal rye crop, it ties up all my nitrogen in the soil. Well, that's great. It can't leach away. That's a good thing. It's great for soybeans because it forces them to nodulate early. So that's both great things. But for corn, if I don't have another way to get nitrogen into that system before the nitrogen in the cereal rye breaks down and cycles back out, which depending on how mature it is, maybe July or August, now I can hurt my corn early on. And so I have to have a nutrient plan for that. So it's a higher level of management to think about how cover crops will affect the nutrient cycling of that. So do that not first, but do that second or third. So look for the biggest fallow gaps, plug them first, and then look for the windows where the easiest termination to the next crop is going to be, and do that next. And then do the hard things, as you get some experience under your belt, as you feel more comfortable with it. And that would be a cover crop, ahead of corn that does not winter kill from the previous year.
So what would you see as some of the challenges or misconceptions that people have about cover crops?
Well, that's a long list.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, probably one of the biggest ones is from the moisture usage standpoint. We still hear people talk about, well, it's going to use all my moisture and I'm not going to be able to grow another crop after that. And again, it really boils down to the management, because that could totally be true depending on how it's managed. But what encouraged us to actually start green cover and go down this path is those experiments we did in 2008. And we saw that the diverse mixtures were much more water efficient than the monocultures. And so, again, there's ways to mitigate some of that. It's what you plant, when you plant it, when you terminate, and when that next crop comes, with the discussion we had with the water recharge cycle. So I still think that's a big misconception, but it can be managed. And there's going to be some years, I'm not going to lie, there's some years where the crop following a cover crop is worse than an area where it didn't have a cover crop, simply because the moisture recharge never came or the timing was off. But nothing works perfectly every year, so you have to look at the bigger picture, the longer play, and not just, 1 year's result. I think another big misconception, particularly with the corn and bean guys, is that I don't have enough time to grow anything. I didn't harvest till November 1st. I'm just putting all my equipment away and going on vacation. And I think that's a misconception, because cereal rye can be planted, deep into December. If you can get the drill in the ground, you can plant rye, you can have some successful cover crops, even planted late. And yeah, it's not diverse, it's not what we'd like to see, with a 6-way mix or something, but you know what? Cereal rye by itself is a whole heck of a lot better than nothing out there. And so that's a misconception, that it gets too late to plant, oftentimes, particularly with rye being an option there. And then I think maybe a third one that I would mention is that I think people think that, my cover crop I didn't produce 5 tons of biomass and have 3 feet of growth out there, so it wasn't worth doing. But, doing root digs and looking at, biological studies, there's a lot of data that suggests that your cover crop doesn't have to be very big in order to have a lot of big impact, both from an erosion prevention standpoint as well as that enhancing the biology standpoint. So, maybe your cover crop only got 8 inches tall before you had to terminate it and go to the next crop. It still did you quite a bit of good that you may not realize, because, as humans, we often just judge what we can see, but the real work is being done with the roots and the biology underground where we can't see it. the better we can measure that, and there's better tests coming out all the time, the more we can say it was worth it because of this, and not just, what I saw.
So, looking towards the future, what innovations or advancements do you see in the near term for cover cropping?
Well, there's some good work being done with, in the plant breeding world. Most of the cover crops that we're using right now are just kind of stuff that, we have found that works, but they weren't necessarily bred specifically for some of the traits that we want. Now, a lot of them are older. Most people would call them heirloom type varieties because they have really robust root systems. And again, so much of the work is being done under the ground that we tend to find that a lot of the older varieties have more developed root systems because they weren't bred specifically just for yield. But with that being said, nobody's really had a concerted effort to breed specifically and select for cover crop properties, root systems and maybe termination dates, winter hardiness, some of these types of things. So there's some work being done on that, through USDA and ARS and different universities. A little bit in the private sector, but it's not a big enough segment yet that you see a lot of the big boys jumping in to get in on the fun of plant breeding specifically for cover crops. But I think that might come. So I see on the horizon better varieties coming out that will have characteristics that are very desirable for cover cropping specifically. So that's exciting. I see, with some of the DNA testing, some of the other biological testing that's, becoming available and more affordable. I see the ability to take a little peek inside of what's going on under the ground, particularly looking at, what root exudates or different things putting out, what segment of the biological population is that supporting, and then what crop following that biology is going to be best. And so that's really what we need to look at is, okay, what crop do I want to grow? What biology does it need? What cover crop do I need to get that biology to support that crop? We're not really there yet. We don't have a good way to analyze and measure root exudate profiles of these different crops. But as that comes, that's going to be very exciting to see then how we can customize and make even better blends based on root exudate profiles. And then maybe one last one here that I'll talk about. We've started doing some sap testing on our cover crops. Not necessarily to try to see, what nutrients are they deficient in so that we can go out and spray that on and make it a better crop. But we're looking at what nutrients and at what levels of concentration are in these cover crops so that if I know that my soil is really low in manganese, well, I can go back and look and see, okay, well, these 6 cover crops had higher levels of manganese concentrations and I didn't add any to it. It was just what it's cycling out of my system. Well, then if you need to free up some manganese for your next soybean crop, well, then here's the cover crops we'd like to see you put in. So that's just some things that we personally, there's some other people working with us and trying to just look at some sap testing profiles of cover crops so that we can make more informed decisions about what would be best ahead of a certain either a crop or a nutrient deficiency we're trying to solve.
So, in terms of a big picture, how do you see or how would you characterize the current state of agriculture here in Nebraska and in the United States?
Well, that's a good question. I would say, we're at a point where I don't think we can any longer sustain the system the way it currently is. Primarily with high inputs, high yields, but high inputs and low profits. And so even aside from environmental sustainability, I think from a financial sustainability, that system is about to break. I think I heard someone say the other day that the break even on corn right now is $5.63. Well, that's about what the market is. And so guys are going to get record revenues, but may not make any money. And so that certainly is not sustainable, long term from a financial perspective. So something's got to change there. Now, because what we've done in large part is just chase yield and try to become profitable by just growing more bushels. And that has worked, for a long time, and people have made a lot of money and have been very successful doing it. But I see that shrinking, and to continue to chase bushels, the added cost, the diminishing return principle is kicking in, and to add those extra bushels to chase that profitability, you're not going to increase your profitability. So the other way to become more profitable is to spend less to grow it, even if you grow less. So I think that we're going to be to a point where guys are going to have other measurements of success other than how many bushels did I yield, and truly looking at how much money did I make. Even if I only grew 80% of what my neighbor did, can I be 20% more profitable? And then the answer is, it depends. It depends on how you did it. And again, it's going to boil down to the management level of the producer. And typically, the higher the management that it requires, you're not going to be able to do it at such scale. And again, I don't know that that's a bad thing necessarily, because it allows more people into the space, which again can help revitalize some of our communities, which, a lot of these small towns are becoming ghost towns and kind of drying up because, if one guy's farming 10, 15, 20,000 acres, well, you just don't need as many people around to do it or to support it. So I think that that's part of it, is that we're going to have to, have some sort of a switch or a change in looking at profit versus yield. And there's lots of ways to get that, reduction of inputs, using biologicals, using cover crops. That's probably a whole nother interview to talk about all those things, but I think that's going to be one of the things that's going to have to be looked at. In Nebraska, the other thing that we don't like to talk about or think about, but we have serious problems with nitrates in our waters. And, to date, there hasn't been a lot of regulation. There's been some parameters, some guidelines, but, if we don't get something fixed and changed, the hammer is going to come down, and there will be a lot of strict regulations, and then that will, in essence, force you to probably have far lower input. So the people that can figure out how to grow on much less input, I think, are going to be ahead in the long run, if and when some of those things do come. Now, I hope we can figure it out ourselves and kind of self-fix the problem, because nobody wants more government regulation. I don't care who you talk to. I mean, that always is a last resort, and it's never a good resort. So I think that there's going to have to be some thought put in around that as well, because it's a problem that even if we stopped putting any nitrogen on at all, which I'm not recommending, by the way, but even if we stop, the nitrogen contamination in the water is still a long-term issue to try to fix, even without any more applied. So it's complicated, and that's the reason not a lot has been done. So yeah, cover crops, can they play a role in that? Absolutely. We've seen some really good studies where guys are putting cover crops into seed corn fields and sequestering 70 to 80 pounds of free nitrogen, tying it up in that cover crop biomass, holding it till the next spring, where then it can be released for the next crop, versus that just setting in the soils. You get a big rain and it washes that or leaches that down. So cover crops can have a really big role to play in that.
I had the opportunity to hear you speak at a recent field day, and one of the things that you talked about was some of the difficulty in researching new practices for agriculture. Agriculture is a complex system. So I'd appreciate, and I think students would profit from your perspective on some of the difficulties in gathering new information to deal with challenges in agriculture.
Yeah, I think what a lot of it boils down to is systems research versus what I would call, and I'm not a scientist, okay, so don't take it with a bit of a grain of salt. It's mostly what I've observed, and listen to other people more intelligent than me discuss. But it's that systems type research versus like a single variable research. Single variable research is how most of it's done. Okay, we're going to do this and we're going to do this, but over here we're changing one thing so we can see what effect that one thing had on the outcome. And in a lot of situations, that's great research and you get great results and you can isolate that variable and really see, okay, well, if I change this or that, then this is how it changes the outcome. And that can be done in a lab, it can be replicated, it's relatively straightforward and, I say simple, but it's straightforward research. But that's not how nature works. You can't isolate a single variable in nature and say with any level of certainty that by changing this, that this outcome changed, because in natural systems, everything is so interconnected and interdependent that changing this one thing, well, that affected 6 other things over here that we're really not measuring. And so my outcome over here, the outcome was because I changed this variable, but it's not just because of that variable. And so I think when scientists, researchers look at regenerative agriculture, soil health, cover crops, whatever you want to term these things, they're still trying to isolate a variable. Well, what if I just, reduce this or take away that or add more of this? And you can see changes, or you maybe don't see changes, but when a farmer does it, he's changing the whole system. I'm adding a 12-way blend cover crop species. Well, that's going to be a different result than if I just planted one thing. I planted sorghum Sudan because I wanted to be able to isolate that variable. Well, that's a huge difference between planting, sorghum and cowpeas and millet and sunflowers and buckwheat and flax and safflower. It's so complex. And so to do systems research is really hard. It's complicated. It's messy. But it is being done. Jonathan Lundgren, I don't know if you've seen some of his research, it's the 1,000 Farms Initiative. In fact, his team of people were out here last week and they did a whole bunch of measurements. They laid out all kinds of transects and collected information on weeds and soils and water and birds. And I mean, it's a very extensive study, but they're doing it on the whole system. And they're going to do it across thousands of farms. And I think they're going to get some really good data because they're comparing regenerative farm practices with conventional. But it's messy, it's hard, it's expensive, and that's why, for the most part, it isn't getting done very well.
I think that it's very valuable for biologists to understand and have a respect for the complexity of the systems that we work with. Physicists have it easy.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, yeah.
Biology is always going to be a complex system because there are so many factors that can influence what's going on. So I think that perspective is really valuable. So talking about a specific complex system that I have some interest in and I have enjoyed growing over the past season here in Nebraska. It's the first crop I ever planted in a new state, 1,000 miles from where I was born. I planted an area with the milpa seed mix that green cover produces and have been completely fascinated by it. So I'm interested in, first, if you would describe that and say a little bit about how that became part of what you do here at Green Cover.
Sure. So milpa is a Mesoamerican term that the Maya people and other indigenous people would have used to describe their farming system, and in fact they're still practicing it. My intern Sophie, who's going to take you around later on here, she just came back from Belize. She spent a couple weeks down there with the Maya people who are still doing this type of agriculture. But basically it's a system where you're growing all these things together. You're taking advantage of the powerful principles of diversity and growing things together, but with the intent of harvesting many of those as food for human consumption. So we took that concept, because we see how diversity works in the field. We see how it works for them, and so what we did is we kind of modified it or adapted it for the farmer or the homesteader, and we're even got a lot of just backyard gardeners who are now doing it. So the milpa mix, it's kind of a diverse cover crop base You know, so it would have clovers and different kinds of leafy brassicas and, you know, some sunflowers and things like that. So just a real nice diverse cover crop base. And then we add to it things that will produce, you know, vegetables. So, you know, we had squash, we had watermelon, cantaloupe, cucumbers, pumpkins, basically anything that we could find that we thought would produce something that, you know, people could eat. We add that to it, and, you know, trying to figure out the right proportions and the ratios so one thing doesn't choke out the other. And then we encourage people to plant that. You get the benefit of diversity for the soil, but there's also things you can go out there and harvest now for yourself or for your community. And so we have a program called the First Acre Program, where if you are willing to donate at least half of what you harvest to your community, food bank, homeless shelter, church, you know, whatever it may be, if you're willing to donate half that to someone else, then we'll give you the seed for free for up to an acre. And it's been a really good program. The Nature Conservancy has helped fund some of that. Syngenta seeds actually have helped by donating. Syngenta is one of the largest producers of vegetable seed in the world. So they donate some of their excess seed to help us, you know, get this out to people for free, because those are expensive seeds. It's not like, you know, just throwing oats out there or something. And it's been successful in that people have got to experience firsthand the power of diversity, and they can see the changes in the soil. They walk out there and you can just feel the life that, you know, not just the plant life, but all of the insect life, the birds. It's just a little ecosystem. It's a little slice of nature that you can grow right there. But then with the added benefit of being able to harvest things, and you can start by harvesting a lot of the leafy greens for, you know, salads and salad mixes, and then progressing into, you know, the fruiting bodies, you know, the cucumbers, the pumpkins, the squash, radishes, turnips, things like that. And so it doesn't work for everybody. Weeds can definitely be the enemy, you know, because once you lay it out there, you have no herbicide options. So again, how you manage it, how you set it up ahead of time is really important. But it's been a fun program, and a lot of people have commented it's just been a joy to go out in it, to try to identify different things growing, to hear insects buzzing, to hear birds chirping. One of the reasons we did it, to be honest, is that far too many farmers no longer grow any food. We talk about how farmers are feeding the world, but let's be honest, for the most part, farmers aren't feeding the world. Most farmers, we're feeding cattle, or we're feeding an ethanol plant. And those are not unimportant things, but when you get disconnected from growing something that someone is going to directly eat, kind of changes your mindset a little bit. And conversely, when you do get reconnected with that, you start thinking through decisions differently, especially if you know your family's going to eat it or your community's going to eat it. And so it's a mindset shift. And if we can shift somebody's mindset on half an acre or an acre, then hopefully the mindset will shift for the broader acres eventually as well. And I'm not saying that it's going to convert somebody over and all of a sudden they're going to grow 1,000 acres of processing tomatoes, but at least it gets people thinking along the lines of what comes out of my ground is going directly into somebody's mouth. Changes the way you think a little bit. So if anybody's interested in that, milpagarden.com is a website you can go to. We've got pictures, videos, all sorts of things on there that document what we're doing. And again, if you're willing to donate some of the produce, we're willing to donate some of the seed.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking your time today. Been, I think, very valuable conversation, and I look forward to many future conversations.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.